Good evening, everybody. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Jon tonight. But I'd also like to add that his lovely wife is here tonight, Sharon. And if you're wondering where she is, she's sitting next to my lovely wife. Anyways, Jon grew up in Connecticut. And, he knows that we're south of the Mason-Dixon line, so he emphasized that I need to tell you that Connecticut is in southern New England. And he graduated from Colgate, with a degree in history, and has 2 master's degrees, one from the Naval War College and one from South Virginia College of Newport, Rhode Island. So he graduated in 71 and got commissioned in the Marine Corps. And he has an unbelievable career. In June of 78, he was assigned as Marine Corps Barracks, Washington, D.C., where he served as executive officer, then commanding officer of the security company at Camp David Presidential Retreat. And then after that, he went back out in the field, or sea, I would say, let's say sea. Right, See, he returned from overseas and he was assigned to command in recruiting. So he was commanding officer there for recruiting for several years. And then as time went by, he was command of Military Expedition Unit Service Group 26. He deployed with the 26th U and participated in Operation Sharp Edge, the evacuation of Monrovia, Liberia. Years later, he went on to command a U.S. support group in Haiti. He served as commander of U.S. forces in Haiti, conducting civil military operations in support of Operation Uphold Democracy. Then he returned from that and went to the Armed Forces Staff College, it's Joint Forces Staff College now, and ultimately became the dean there. So what a career. Now, one thing I do have to ask, are you making some of this up? I mean, this is almost too good to be true, all the stuff you've done, these books. I can Google it. Okay, but all this pales in comparison to the most recent event in his and Sharon's life. They've had their first grandchild. Just how long ago? November 7th. So like I said, everything pales in comparison to that. So anyways, and his name is Nathan. Who else do we know that's named Nathan? Who once said, I regret I only have but one life to give for my country. Would that be the connection?
I can say that tonight.
Anyways, I'll get off the stage. Get the hook. Ray would be saying, get the hook.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'm going to, like he says, I'm Jon Stull. I haven't changed from when I was sitting down to up here on the introduction. It's my honor to be here to speak to you about the Battle of Great Bridge. This came about while we were going to a baseball game to see the Mets destroyed by the Nats this summer. And he asked me a question of what do I do in retirement? And so I talked to him about the Battle of Great Bridge. He says, oh, we got to get you to the Norfolk Historic Society. I said, so that's what gets me here. I guess, like he mentioned, I'm a Connecticut Yankee. So I was born and raised on Lexington and Concord. And I knew very little about, I had not learned anything about the Battle of Great Bridge until my youngest son comes back from school with an assignment on it. And in looking at that and my cursory study of that, I said, well, there's a lot. There's very little literature considering the significance of the event. So I'm here tonight to try to convince you of the significance of the event. I've talked, and so have my fellow docents, Lou Mosier that's back there that was at the table, and Stan Romez. We speak to a lot of 5th graders because they visited the park, and now that the park's under construction, we go to the schools. We've taken a number of, I've taken a number of groups there from the Staff College and from the Naval War College, because it also has that amount of significance. But as I do in schools, let's get this started to get you in the mood. I usually ask them, how does the word get out back in colonial times since there was no internet? To all who shall see these presents, greetings and caution. Know ye that despite the most heroic sacrifice by His Majesty's troops at Great Bridge, they have withdrawn to Norfolk to thwart any rebel advances on this, our most prosperous of ports. At this notice be advised that the rebel forces of Norfolk County and Princess Anne counties have been augmented by North Carolinians and on the march for Norfolk. Lord Dunmore assures residents of Norfolk that this realignment of forces will not compromise the safety of the port. Further, the Lord Governor orders the loyal subjects of King George to give neither aid nor comfort to those enemies of the crown. Loyal subjects of Norfolk have little to fear, as Lord Governor, with the Royal Navy and his forces at his disposal, will remain in Norfolk to protect this most loyal community. Those who fear for their safety should remove themselves from their present environs and hasten closer under the guns of His Majesty's ships now in port to remain protected. To all, remain alert and sound the alarm upon provocation. Well, I won't go through in that style for the rest of the evening, but that would be the way, particularly on this evening, 242 years ago tonight, there would be many of you getting under the shelter of Lord Dunmore's guns, because the Patriots have united down in Great Bridge. And now they've been joined by the North Carolinians and they're on the march. And tomorrow, over 1,200 Patriots will occupy Norfolk. So for those of you that have been loyal to the crown, better switch those hat bands very quickly. I will attempt to go on the mic here and try to temper my voice as I go through this presentation. So I'd like to, is that lovely?
That's good.
Is that good? I'm used to screaming, so I'll try to talk quietly. So tonight, what I'd like to do in this next hour is to convey to you why Great Bridge, why we fight the British since we have been loyal colonists, and then what kind of significance this has. Usually with the fifth graders, and here I'm going to mix the fifth grader information with the graduate school information, so bear with me. Hopefully it comes out in some semblance of manner. But first, I always like to get oriented and just ask my wife how much I like maps. So the first thing I want to do is get a map of the area. And usually with the fifth graders, we ask them, what are the geographic features here? Of course, you are old salts concerning the area, so you recognize the Atlantic and the Chesapeake and the James. But what's of particular importance now will be in this area here is the Elizabeth and the three forks that it has. The eastern branch out to now Kempsville, then Kemp's Landing, the southern branch down to Great Bridge, and the western branch. And it's about the ability to control access to that waterway, and as it relates to the entire region, that creates this tension. I usually ask them, okay, what's the capital of the colony at the time? And of course, they'll come up with eventually Williamsburg. If they missed it, then I'll walk them from Jamestown up to Williamsburg. The most significant port, of course, at the time is the port at York, or Yorktown. Hampton is a significant port, but more tonnage goes through Yorktown. And then a growing port is Norfolk. At this time, in 1775, it is the fifth largest port on the eastern seaboard. Its significance is, of particular significance, is it is the only seaboard port between New York and Charleston. New York and Charleston are large ports. The largest is Philadelphia, but it's difficult to get to. The other major port, as you're well aware, is Boston. But in the winter of '75, that's a difficult place to get into, unless you're British. And so Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Norfolk, and Charleston are the major ports at the time. Of particular notice for us is the challenge that we're going to have as we try to connect the bodies of water between North Carolina and Chesapeake and the trade that may come from that. And so I talked to them as, okay, why is this particular area or this particular region of value to either Crown or to Patriot? And that's what we want to consider for tonight. Ultimately, in the course of the night, we will end up here at Great Bridge. All right. The colonial economy, and of course this is what I'm pulling out of the fifth graders, and they're pretty good at this. My motto in the morning is to wake up and see if I can be smarter than a fifth grader. Since Mike has already identified me as a Marine, that's a challenge. So I have to be, a couple dozen push-ups, and then can I be, better than a fifth grader? Two major things are coming out of this region. One, of course, the agricultural commodities, the wheat, the corn, the beef, the pork, and of course, the king of it all, tobacco. And that's what primarily is coming out of York. Our region down here is more of the provision type. But the other important thing out of this area are the timber products. The whole idea of the lumber that can come out of the forests that are not really as thoroughly harvested down here and in North Carolina, and then particularly what comes from the swamps and the marsh. And it's that tar, the pitch, and the turpentine. Why are these so important and so important for the Crown? Well, the good Lord Governor, as we've talked to, is pretty close to this man by the name of Andrew Sproul that you heard of, I think, last month when we talked about Gosport. And he has a shipyard there, and he has visions of building vessels for the Royal Navy. And so they need the tall, the pine for the masts. They need the tar and the pitch to seal the boats and to do that shipbuilding. So it's of a particular importance for him on that, as well as the provisions that help for Norfolk and the fleets that come in and the export that can be gained. Like I mentioned earlier, there are basically two watersheds. And this is of importance because it is difficult to get commerce between the two. As you would imagine, you have the watershed that pours into the Chesapeake, and then the Carolina Sounds. And so they're drawing away from each other. The challenge is that the seagoing ports are here in the Chesapeake. It's difficult out of the Sounds in North Carolina because of the shifting shoal water. That's why the pirates left it so rough. They could tuck in there, they knew the waters, and they could stay. It's difficult to do a lot of heavy trade out of there. So the preferred is to get any of this product from North Carolina and bring it up to Norfolk, but that creates a challenge. And this challenge was realized fairly early on. Trying to get trade to go through Norfolk or to a body of water. What I talk to the young students about is those are the interstates of colonial times, our waterways. The roads are not good. You can do it by road. You can put your ton on a cart and try to get it to market, or you can get several tons and get it on a flatboat and take it up on water. And so for many of these farmers, it made sense to bring your goods to a water point and then float it in bulk up to a point where then it could be transported. Because that was so important here, in the latter part of the 17th century, we create the Great Ward, the Great Road. Thomas Butt was designated as surveyor, and he surveyed a road that would then connect Great Bridge, or the southern branch of the Elizabeth River. Can't see it so well on that. And this road would then connect Great Bridge to North River Landing, where the North River comes up. So that those that drew their provisions out of the Sounds could take it up the Northwest River or the North Landing River, and then get it on land to another waterway, either the southern branch or the eastern branch to take it to Norfolk. And that was more productive and less costly for them than to try to take it out of the Carolina Sound. So in order to do that, you build this road. And where it was moist, just like we do today if we're camping, you knock down timber and lay it crosswise the way you're walking, and you create sort of a semi-permanent pathway. Where it got particularly swampy, you would make a causeway. And this is the example of a causeway we have at the park today. It's basically 14-inch diameter of timbers that are created in a crib. You fill that with items that won't rot, and then top it with oyster shells for drainage, so that keeps you off the swampy water. Where you get to water that you can't bridge with a causeway, or that you need to make sure runs underneath, you have bridges. And so the greatest of those bridges happened to be built at a place called Bridgeton. And since it connected to the Great Road, it later became Great Bridge. And so by this time it is known as Great Bridge. And the challenge then comes is, okay, that's the geography, that's the setting. Why the tensions? Why does this path to war develop between his loyal subjects, which only wanted to be treated like any other Englishman, and the crown itself? Well, we won't go through the entire history, because that would take longer than you would want me to be up here babbling, and then I'd open myself to too many errors, although I do have a couple folks in the audience that I know that are probably identifying what might be misspoken. But if you recall, this whole thing, as a good old New Englander, I'd have to put the beginning of the great poem up front. Doesn't mean much to us today, because it dealt with Paul Revere's ride, but what it should make reference to is that 2 days later, it's the magazine in Williamsburg that is of significance. And late on the night of the 20th, Lord Dunmore, in order to protect the powder, to protect himself and the colony, the rightful civil authority, he sends a party of Royal Marines from the Magdalene to raid this, to appropriate and then move the ammunition aboard vessel so it can be protected. It goes well, except as they leave, they're detected. They successfully get their 15 half casks of gunpowder to the ship, but Lord Dunmore has been found out, and it creates great protest. And in the colonial times, who is the orator that can protest the most loudly? Patrick Henry. And so it's a contest between Lord Dunmore and Patrick Henry on his right to even get into the magazine and to rob the colonists of the use of the powder that might be there. Lord Dunmore tries to make his case. It's back and forth. Ultimately, in the course of May, as we go through the month of May, he agrees to pay for the powder and the ammunition that may have been taken, which then tends to settle things down. So life is good, but he does hear about the gathering of militia that he did not order up. And so militia are gathering in Fredericksburg through the month of May and then in June, and he fears that they will come in the next disagreement down to Williamsburg, and thus put him and his family in somewhat of a threat. So he decides, perhaps it's best to get my family out of here. And on the 8th of June, he takes his family aboard the Magdalene and sails out of Williamsburg. It's the best I can do. I know this is a day and age that should be popping and snapping, but that's the best I can do. After all, I'm a colonial. And then he comes back to manage the colony, but then moves ultimately to His Majesty's ship, the Fowey, and then decides to leave Yorktown and come down into Norfolk to administer the colony from aboard ship. So that kind of puts the month of June behind him. He's starting to feel his way around Norfolk and what might be important. And at the end of July, after he's done some small raiding, he gets great news. He is reinforced with a detachment of 60 soldiers from the 14th Regiment of Foot. And so now he can probably get things done in good order. And so the month of August, he tries to get them quartered. One of the places is, of course, at Gosport. Andrew Sproul, being a Scotsman, just like Lord Dunmore, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, decides that they work in concert with each other. But something happens in September that makes much of this agreement run afoul, and that's something called, what some people have called the Hurricane of Independence. Another thing that I was unaware of, but on the 2nd of September, a major storm hits the eastern coast and actually rolls up from the Carolinas all the way up the coast to Maine, creating, as you would imagine, the type of damage that you get from a hurricane. Many of the tenders to the boats, His Majesty's vessels, are washed up and run aground. They have to be recovered. They have to be repaired. So much of September is dealt with doing that. One of those tenders happens to belong to the HMS Otter. And Captain Matthew Squire is in this running dialogue with the citizens of Hampton, because it had been washed up into Back River to try to get what was goods there and the crew that were aboard that tender back under His Majesty's control. And it's not doing well. That argument persists and is written in the press. And the press of that day, of course, the Virginia Gazette out of Norfolk, it has recently changed hands. And in the month of August, it is bought out by a gentleman by the name of John Hunter Holt. A lot of times in the books down here, it's referred to as John Holt. And I realize you don't want to refer to him as John Holt. He is the son of John Holt. And John Holt is a patriot publisher out of New York and out of Boston. His son comes down here, buys the Gazette, and now starts to publish information that both Captain Squire and Lord Dunmore think is fake news. We know how that goes. Now, the answer to the fake news is what starts this furious fall of 75. And on the end of the month, the 30th of September, they've had enough of these reports, this fake news. And so what do? Their modus operandi is to call out the landing party, seize the press, and so they take John Holt's press, bring it aboard the Eelbeck, which later becomes the Dunmore as far as the ship's name. And so now they can control the voice of what the populace needs to hear. Fascinating themes on how history repeats itself sometimes. So with that now antagonizing many of the colonists and the Virginia Convention, which is the ongoing government since the royal government isn't sitting, the tensions continue to heighten. From that particular incident, remember it was about the challenge of Captain Squire to get back the possessions, both the crew and the materials that were in a tender that had washed ashore because of the hurricane, washed ashore at Hampton. He was unable to get this cooperation from those in Hampton, and it fell into Patriot hands, and they weren't about to give it up. And so on the 25th, he raids in the night Hampton to try to get goods. The following day, then he tries again, but the riflemen there keep him at bay. And then that next night, Colonel Woodford, who is the regimental commander of the 2nd Virginia Militia, who you'll hear about in just a moment after this, comes down with another company of Culpeper Minutemen that are on horseback. Now, the Culpeper Minutemen and the Culpeper Battalion are known as riflemen. They use the Virginia, or who knows what label, long rifle, because they're hunters from the northern counties of Virginia. And the 5 companies of them had been stood up, a company being 50 riflemen, to augment the 2nd Virginia Militia that was stood up by the convention and under the command of Colonel Woodford. So he comes down, and because of their ability to pick the crew off as they come up to man the guns, the Royal Navy has to back off Hampton and then go back and think of how else to approach this. So this is not a big victory, it's more of a big disappointment for Lord Dunmore and for Captain Squire. Because he's fed up with this, Lord Dunmore decides, I've got to squelch this rebellion. And he does something that he has been thinking of, ruminating on for months, but has not cleared it with the Secretary of the Colonies back in London. And he comes up with what's called Dunmore's Proclamation. He signs it on the 7th of November, and in that basically establishes martial law in the colony of Virginia, because the threat has been too great of all this rebellion that's taking place. In doing so, he takes 100 regulars and marches to Kemp's Landing to raise the King's standard and to ask for people to pledge their allegiance. In so doing, that body of regulars, as they approached, the secondary reason for going to Kemp's Landing is he heard that there was recruiting for the Patriots going on there in an attempt to try to create a stronger Patriot force to meet up with Colonel Woodford, who is on his way. There's an ambush that the Patriots set up because they hear that he's coming. But it's triggered by the Grenadiers, and as good soldiers, they face the fire, charge into it, and the Patriots flee. Many are captured, several are killed, only one Grenadier is wounded. So the Grenadiers and Lord Dunmore feel pretty good about themselves. All we have to do is show up with these Grenadiers, at least 6 feet tall, with the additional cone cap, with the bayonets glistening in the sun, as they say, and the Patriots will flee. He publishes his proclamation, and he gets many people, hundreds, he says, thousands actually, he says 3,000, he reports back, that have sworn allegiance to the crown. And if they were able-bodied men, then they were expected to serve for His Majesty in what was called the Queen's Own Loyal Virginia Regiment. But then the tickler to this proclamation were the next issues that he puts out there. He said, for any indentured servant that served, whose owner is a rebel, in Dunmore's eyes, and any slave, if you will pledge your loyalty to the king, you will be armed and you will be in a unit that can fight for the king. And upon completion of service, you will be free. You won't have any more servitude. Well, sounds pretty good to a number of folks that were in that servitude situation, and not too good to their owners. As a consequence of this, there's about 350 indentured servants and loyalists of the crown that create the Queen's Own Regiment, Queen's Own Loyal Regiment from Virginia, and about 200 here of slaves that become part of Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment. This, of course, sets the scene for what happens at Great Bridge, which we'll talk in much more detail, and then ultimately what happens here in Norfolk the following New Year's. Okay, so on to Great Bridge. Just to take a look at how things happened as as that evolution of events took place. September 30th, the season of Holt's Press takes place. The Virginia Convention is seized with this issue, and this really bothers them. They're getting pleas from people that are in Norfolk to say, please, come to our aid. Lord Dunmore is exceptionally abusive. And so with that, the convention then sends a notice and gives an order to Colonel William Woodford, who's the commander of the 2nd Regiment, that he is to go down to Portsmouth, Norfolk area to put pressure on Dunmore to drive him out of Norfolk. That's Colonel Woodford's goal. He receives this the 3rd week in October, but then as I mentioned, the 26th, the raid on Hampton takes place, the 25th and 26th, so he diverts comes down to assist in the defense of Hampton, and then by the first week in November is back in Williamsburg and ready to set forth on his trip down to the Great Bridge area. Now, this is a difficult thing for him because all he has are patriots, farmers, musket men and riflemen, and they have horses, but they can only travel by land. He can't travel on the water because the water is owned by the British. The Royal Navy, there's at least 4, depending how you count them, 5 men of war in Norfolk, and with all their tenders, they patrol up here to ensure that kind of force doesn't cross the water. So in his drive to get here, he goes up above Jamestown, and where the waters start to narrow, when he doesn't see ships, then he crosses the James, and then comes down the southern bank of the James, staying south of the river and north of the swamp. And that's one thing I'd like to point out here is this swamp. This is today's swamp. The swamp back then, basically, most of this was green, and most of the back bay was green. And so it was hard to find hard stand. As a matter of fact, one of the Hessians records this as the Great Green Sea, as he tries to look down here, trying to find a place to come. So what happens is he comes to Great Bridge, and why Great Bridge? It is the only land route to get to Norfolk. Matter of fact, someone says, oh, it's the only land route from the south. No. At this time, colonial times, it's the only road, land route from anywhere, because you can't cross the water. So Great Bridge becomes the point where you can stop any movement. Now, certainly, you could stop movement at the eastern branch, but this would give, if you had an adversary, this would give him too much time to get up here and perhaps cross earlier on the Elizabeth River on one of the branches. So this becomes key. The Battle of Kemp's Landing and, of course, the Great Bridge. Okay, who's involved? Again, I put the who's up here and the what's and the why's, because many times with the 5th graders, trying to get them into thinking who, what, why, when, where. But 3 major units for the British. The most significant is the 14th Regiment of Foot. It is commanded by Captain Samuel Leslie. There's 120. Some records have it as high as 140, but 120 that came up from St. Augustine, Florida, to finally give Lord Dunmore a force other than naval. Of that, half of that are grenadiers. So there's 2 companies. One is light infantry and one is grenadiers. The captain of the grenadiers will be introduced to in just a moment. That's a Captain Charles Fordyce. To augment them, because it's under martial law and there's been development of trying to get colonists to be loyal to the crown, they form the Queen's Own Loyal Virginia Regiment. And of course, as I mentioned before, for the slaves, arm the slaves of the rebels and create the Ethiopian, Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. And so those are the forces for the crown. On the Patriot side, as I mentioned, the 2nd Virginia Regiment, there's only 2 Virginia regiments right now. The 1st Virginia Regiment is led by a notable person by the name of Patrick Henry, and the 2nd one is led by William Woodford. William Woodford is a veteran of the French and Indian War and had served with Washington. Patrick Henry did a good job of talking, and still does. But that's and was a bit upset that they sent William Woodford down here to defend or to put pressure on Dunmore. But he was told that it's important to have protection up there at Williamsburg, and so he was told to stay there. In addition to them, as I mentioned before, the Culpeper Minutemen, the frontiersmen from the northern counties of Virginia, had come down to augment this force. Great Bridge, a colonial map drawn by one of the engineers with the Brits, and it is oriented with the north at the top. I mean, if you were to read the map, and we have it out there, it's actually oriented in the direction they're marching. So it would be upside down for us. But this would be the Elizabeth River. and pretty much where it was then. Then there was a bridge that crossed it, and that was the Great Bridge. It crossed it to an island where there was a bunch of wharfs and flatboats, and then there was a connecting causeway from there into town, and then the town of Great Bridge lay there. So this would be the current Battlefield Boulevard. This would be Cedar Road. This was a church, and now because we like to preserve historic monuments, it's a BB&T. But it's the high ground, and so this is important because if you're going to stay out of the muck, high ground is of high premium, even if you're a farmer or if you're an infantryman that's got to sleep on the ground, you'd like to get as dry as you can. What you don't see, of course, is the canal that's there now. And the canal that's there now basically runs this way. The river's still where it is, but the canal runs this way, and of course that wasn't there then. All the other stuff that's not yellow is marsh and swamp. So there's very little places where you can move other than across the bridge and on the Causeway. Lord Dunmore recognizes how significant this is. This is not a blindside to him. He's not stupid. He just has a difficult way of relating to people. And he writes to General Howe, who now has the British forces, what he intends, what he has done, and why he has done it. And what he did is, just before going to Kemp's Landing, he came down and created a stockade fort. It was located where that square is turning, and left a detachment of 1 officer and 25 regulars, plus some Ethiopian and Virginia loyalist troops to man the fort, to hold that critical point. Why? Because he doesn't want to be cut off from provisions from the south, and he doesn't want to be cut off from that potential shipbuilding supply. He still has visions of Norfolk and Gosport being a major port and building the Royal Navy ships. So he recognizes the significance. On the other hand, we have Colonel Woodford, and he is coming down the peninsula. He crossed the river, major force crossed the river in the middle of November, and they're coming on down. But they stop and they try to gather more militia as they come, trying to excite the Patriots and the excitement in their hearts to join in. Also, he has to try to get more powder and to run more ball, in other words, create more shot. He's not being supplied well. Most of his correspondence back to the convention is very much like Washington's correspondence back to the Continental Congress. I need more supplies. In fact, one of his memos talks about how the weather is so damp and cold and foul, and there's no straw for the men to sleep on us. Can't we afford to at least get another blanket so each soldier has 2 blankets? Oh, and a pair of shoes, would be thing they were hoping for. He gets to Suffolk, he starts to gather more supplies there, and he sends his second in command, a gentleman by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Scott, as an advance party leader to go to Great Bridge to see if he can protect the citizens, see what the situation is. So Lieutenant Colonel Scott, who after the war later becomes the 4th governor of Kentucky, takes an advance party and starts to build a breastwork. Actually, the breastwork was about 7 feet high, about 120 feet long, across the road that would have led to the Causeway. So if you cross the bridge, you'd have to go through this small wharf area and then follow the Causeway down, but now it's blocked. So Dunmore is cut off from his supplies, but likewise, the Patriots are cut off from getting pressure on Dunmore. So this becomes a decisive point for both the Patriots and for the Crown. And this is why it's different, why we say this is the first battle of the Revolutionary War, because this is an intended battle. A raid is done in surprise, a skirmish is kind of a meeting engagement nobody was planning on, but this, both sides intended to defend this ground. Lieutenant Colonel Scott makes it on the 28th of November and starts to set up defenses and starts to mobilize militia that are close by. By the 2nd of December, the main force, so now you have a total of about more than 650 patriots have now gathered at Great Bridge, and this starts to grow even further to the point where it's just under 1,000 end up being on the Patriot side by the time the conflict takes place. They continue to build these, and then in anticipation that artillery will come up from North Carolina, they build entrenchments to their left flank. And if they got artillery, they can fire directly at the fort. They don't have it, but they've heard that North Carolina is going to bring them up with reinforcements. Dunmore has heard this too. And so this is why the element of time is so urgent. Dunmore wants to make sure that he takes this bridge before reinforcements get there. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for him. This is just a stockade fort, and if any artillery came up, it would not withstand anything other than musket. So this becomes critical to him. On the night of the 8th, because he sees this timing as so critical, and also because a servant of Thomas Marshall, who was a major with the Culpeper Minutemen, and brought along his son, who was a lieutenant by the name of John Marshall, who shows up significantly in our history later. His servant gets captured. We don't know whether this was intentional or whether the servant actually deserted. But the legend is that the servant told Lord Dunmore, or the authorities, that there was only 300 patriots, or 300 shirtmen as they were called, that are south of that barricade, and there's no artillery. Dunmore, thinking that soon the North Carolinians would arrive, he says, now is the time to attack. So he tells Captain Samuel Leslie, take all the regulars we have, go down and augment the fort, and then at dawn on the 9th, I want you to take the breastworks. And the plan is that at just before dawn, that there would be 2 companies of the Ethiopian troops that would cross at a boat guard further downstream, and then come in and threaten the rear, thus forcing the attention to be in the reverse, and then the attack would take place. But as with most military plans, that portion of the plan didn't take place. So on the morning of the 9th, Captain Samuel Leslie, who's in charge of the entire endeavor, puts Captain Charles Fordyce, the commander of the Grenadiers, in charge of the assault, and they press for the assault. As they press, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, the Culpeper Minutemen, the riflemen, don't go to the breastworks, but they go to the flanking positions, because with their rifles, they have twice the distance of range, and so they can shoot the 200 yards. And so now, when the assault takes place, not only does Captain Fordyce and his Grenadiers have to go head on into it, but they are also flanked by rifle fire. Ultimately, then the rest of the force joins in the battle, and that takes place. On that morning, the British have popped all the planks on the bridge so it can't be used. They hold it in the fort. So when somebody wants to cross, they can control who crosses. So at night, they pop all that. The Patriots then take advance guards and put them out in front to see, at night, to see what kind of movement's going on out of the fort. During the daylight, they come back into the fortifications on the Patriot side. So it's kind of a cat and mouse game, and it's been that way for 2 weeks. But on the morning of the 9th, the same thing takes place. You hear some shots back and forth. They start to put down these planks. The advance guard for the Patriots, and there's 3 of them there, are there, and they're sighting them. They start to take some shots at them as they come to try to hold up their progress. And they're somewhat successful, and so then they break to go back to the breastworks, which they're supposed to do. But another significant name in this battle is a guy by the name of Billy Flora, who is a free black man who was a blacksmith, and was fighting on the Patriot side. And he, in his first started to turn and remembered, hey, they pulled up planks to keep us from going. Let me go back there and pop a couple planks to hold them up. And so he goes back to pop a few planks and makes it back. And more than one journal entry from more than one person has indicated that he took the time to take 8 shots back at the British, even though they're firing at him. So my hat's off to him and his ability to hold his ground and to disrupt the attack. But the British do make it across. And so they set up 2 4-pounders. That's the only artillery they have. They have some other guns that are of smaller caliber back in the fort. But these 2 4-pounders now can fire directly on the Patriot position. I'm sorry. That was the Patriot volley. And for those of you that were dozing off, you're back with me. Okay. I knew there was a reason why I had that. But as they come across the Causeway, Charles Fordyce, oh, you'll have to go through it. That was an inadvertent hit. Sorry about that. But he's formed his grenadiers up on the Causeway. But the Causeway is only so wide to get 6 across at a time, where, as you know, with British tactics, you get them all on line, so you get all the muskets pointing forward. Well, he can only get 6. And they fall. But there's 6 across, and they're 10 deep for one company. There's 2 companies in the assault. And so this is a tremendously dense target for Patriots. You know, they're wearing the reds, so that's an easy target. You've got Lieutenant Travis and 60 Patriots at the breastwork, and they're seeing this taking place. Now, they've sent the word back to BB&T to say, hey, Colonel Woodford, how about sending some more down here? Because you've got almost 1,000 Patriots there. But the coolness of Lieutenant Travis is he holds there, he tells the men, okay, hang on, wait till they get to this creek, which is basically wait till you see the whites of their eyes, which is about 50 yards out. And that's where we have a marker there today to say, okay, this is where we think the first volley went, the one that woke some of us up. And so that first volley catches that first assault force. It catches Charles Fordyce in the knee. He goes down, but it's a grazing wound, so he gets back up. He tries to rally his men. He says, come on, today is our own. Remember who we are. And they go for the breastwork. Of course, by this time, the Culpeper Minutemen have come down into the flanking position. And so now, as they assault the breastwork, not only are they hitting the head-on fire of the Patriots, but they're getting the flanking fire from the Culpeper Minutemen. And so the result did not work well. An American account of what took place is there. And again, it gives praise to Fordyce. But at the end of the assault, he lies dead about 15 feet from the breastworks with 14 bullet wounds in him. There is another officer down and 17 grenadiers who have been killed. In addition, there's 30 wounded. Now, forgive me for my math on a stage in public, but that's almost half your assault force. That's not a good sign. That's not a good day. They try to continue the assault, but then they realize, well, this doesn't make sense. Let's go back to the island. And they talk to the next senior, Colonel Leslie, Captain Leslie, and he says, no, let's retire from now, spike our guns, let's get back to the fort. The aftermath, though, as I said, half of the assault force is either dead or wounded before the breastworks. The Patriots, out of consideration of the honorable way the British had served, get the wounded, get them back behind their breastworks for protection. And in fact, there was a good job of this by many as they pulled them back there to give them some chance for life. But 2 accounts of what the battlefield looked like. One, both young people as far as battle is concerned, a midshipman on the British side And then Patriots' reaction, and this is probably a young man who's never been in battle before and sees his first battle. Again, with an assault like that, multiple wounds on numbers of bodies, and so it can get a can be a pretty gruesome sight. Those that were recovered were brought back to ordinaries or taverns, inns. One of the proprietors of one of the ordinaries was a gal by the name of Polly Miller, and she was accredited for having saved 6 lives, taking care of the British wounded that were there. Because of the generosity of spirit, so to speak, of caring for the wounded and not mauling people that were wounded, and under flag of truce, prisoners and casualties were exchanged, but Captain Samuel Leslie saluted the Patriots. They had anticipated and were fed the story that if they were caught by Patriots, they'd be scalped, because these were all frontiersmen. And so it was with great respect that Captain Leslie honored and saluted the Patriot force for their ability to hold their ground and to deal with the wounded, the dead and wounded as they did. Wrong one. Okay, so comes night. Captain Leslie's in there. He's lost half of his assault force. Again, there's many loyalists and Ethiopian troops, but the British, in their fashion, they only really count the British regulars. So half of them are gone. Among them is his nephew, who was a lieutenant. So it's probably, you know, go with Uncle Samuel Leslie and he'll take care of it. Well, he's failed in that. And so he decides under cover of darkness he will go back to Norfolk. And so they make it out the next day. They cautiously, Colonel Woodford's a very cautious individual, cautiously goes forward to take a look of how things went to see if anybody's in the fort. As they go, they see that the fort's unoccupied, they gather the equipment that's there, but he does have this observation. He had reported that there were 70 casualties the day before. He writes back to Edmund Pendleton, who's the chair of the Committee of Safety and who he reports to, much to the disgust of Patrick Henry, who thinks he should be reporting back to him, that it was probably even more gruesome than he gave credit. And some estimates were that there were 100 casualties. All British. The only wounded on the American side was Lieutenant Thomas Nash, who got wounded in the finger. So this is what Colonel Woodford would later go on to say. This was the Bunker Hill of the South, with the exception that the Patriots held their ground. The British go back to Norfolk. The 14th Regiment of Foot goes directly back aboard ship. They do not stop to create defenses and entrenchments there at Norfolk, even though they've been started. And there is a fairly adequate defensive line because of the bodies of water. But some would say it would have taken 5,000 men to man it. He said, enough of this, I'm going to go back under the cover of being under a captain's authority, and gets back aboard the ship. Consequently, because of perhaps town crier messages that were earlier cried out, people gathered under Lord Dunmore's protection. Norfolk's a Tory town. Most towns that were on this, made their living on this by the sea, were loyal to the crown because that was their protection. So it only made sense. So much of the population tries to gather close and get aboard the men of war. So it gets very crowded there. The more distinguished families got aboard. The lesser families got whatever floating craft they could and tried to get out there. So by the time of the Patriots close on Norfolk, which will be tomorrow, 242 years ago, there's a Dunmore's floating city of about 70 craft out there in the harbor. 4 or 5 men of war and the rest of various vessels, the tenders and whatnot. You can imagine, once the Patriots are here, they say, okay, you don't need to come ashore. You've got your government aboard ship and all your loyalists, you stay there. But you can imagine with that many people aboard ship, water becomes a pretty tight commodity, food, the living just became pretty intolerable on a lot of those. Patriots don't allow them to come ashore for water, even though the correspondence back and forth is very cordial and very polite. You know, the answer is always no. We won't allow that to happen. It becomes such a distress that it really aggravates both the captains and Lord Dunmore. And actually, the lack of discipline or the spite of some of the Patriots, because they take pot shots at the ships while they were out there, which really annoyed the captains, you can imagine. But there was, the convention didn't want to give way either, probably because there's a significant American up in Boston who by this time has found out the plight of Lord Dunmore, who he does not like at all, and has given direction that having him just aboard ship is not good enough. You need to get him out of Virginia, and you need to do it any way you can. So Dunmore gets to the point where he demands, if you don't let me come ashore, then I'm going to bombard this town, and you will pay the price. Try to intimidate them into accepting that demand. We know what happened. We got proof. Right? We got the cannonball at St. Paul's. But and then what the rest of the story somewhat gets hidden in history, at least for about 70 years. The bombardment starts in the afternoon, about 3 o'clock. Some have it a little bit before, some have it a little bit after. Of course, the Timexes weren't invented yet, so that's why some of the difference in time. There was 100 cannon that could be brought to bear on Norfolk. Not all of them at the same time, but that's the number of major pieces that could be used. It lasts 10 hours. Some accounts have it lasting 25. I think it depends on how you're hearing and how close you are to things going off, on how that takes place. But it goes through the night. Naturally, some of that shelling starts some fires. Additionally, they send some raiding parties in to get provisions. And then once they got the provisions, is to set a fire. Or if they were not allowed to get provisions, set a fire. Or create chaos. Unfortunately, it was very windy that day. And so the fire starts to spread. The Patriots figure, well, most of this is Tory property, so we'll stand back and watch it burn. They don't have a lot of desire to protect the Tories. Then they think, well, let's make it so they have no need to come back. And so they start setting some of the fires too. First, plunder the building, take the goods, especially the rum, and then light the fire. Much of that's done, and 70 years later, as we take a look at the records, and Pat Hannum, who's in the audience, don't mean to draw too much attention to you, I have his article out there, but in a most recent article in the Journal of American Revolution, details the amount of destruction, what was British and what was Patriot. And ultimately, more than 90% of the destruction of Norfolk being burned was Patriot. Now, there was still about 400 dwellings left at the end of this. Dunmore then pulls his ships away. They pull over to Tucker's Point so they can at least get water and put baking ovens ashore so they don't burn their fleet. And it's kind of a stalemate for a while. But on the 15th of January, the Virginia Convention says, yeah, no sense in you standing there in a standoff with Dunmore. Why don't you go ahead and torch the rest of the town? We'll make it so there's no reason to come back. And so, as good soldiers, they said, sure, let's do this. And they burn the rest of the town. And on the 6th of February, they abandon Norfolk. And there's nothing left here really to deal with. So, just a quick review. Woodford, having defended the Hampton, comes down all the way north of the swamp, south of the river to Great Bridge. Conducts the battle. He is reinforced then 2 days later, well, the next day after the battle, and then finally 2 days later, Colonel Robert Howe, who's a Continental, so he outranks Colonel Woodford, join forces, and they proceed to Norfolk. As I mentioned, after the burning of Norfolk, Dunmore goes over and uses Tucker Point as a place where he can tie to get water and to do provisions. That lasts for a while, and then ultimately he pulls up and sails his floating city of what some people said to this time was about 90 craft up to Gwynn's Island, and he establishes a point there in an attempt to think, okay, when things smooth over and we get reinforcements, I can take back the colony. Well, by this time, Virginia has decided to make their own decisions as far as government is concerned, and then ultimately the nation makes that same decision on the 4th of July with the Declaration of Independence. The week after, then Brigadier Andrew Lewis and a combined gathering of both 1st and 2nd Virginia militias and others put pressure on Gwynn Island. There's a battle for Gwynn Island. Ultimately, Lord Dunmore has to quit that place. He doesn't leave the Chesapeake immediately. He goes up to St. George's Island for a while, but then by August, he figures this is done and I have to leave. And so he sails thinking to New York, but ultimately he ends up back home. But this then leads to, okay, so what? Why is this significant? I understand why they fought each other. I understand how that happened. But so what? It was only the 10th of the size of Bunker Hill. I mean, only 100 casualties. What possibly could have been the significance? Well, it has us dealing with absentee government. And so politically, we make the decision that we don't need the royal government. We're going to make these decisions on our own. And so that takes place in December. And then ultimately on the 15th of May, the convention not only starts to articulate how they're going to govern themselves in detail, but then also resolves that their representatives to the Second Continental Congress will push to declare the United Colonies free and independent states, just as they have done, because they had no protection from the crown, and they were doing just fine. And then they select the first governor, Patrick Henry. So maybe not being selected as the commander of Great Bridge dealt him pretty well. Politically, that's a big impact. The other impact, I would say, is militarily. Virginia is known as the breadbasket of the colonies at this time. The largest population, the most amount of produce is coming out of Virginia, so it's very valuable. It has this incredible estuary all the way up. And we take this for granted now, but this is just a great thing back then to get goods moving. So if you think of what comes out of the Hampton Roads area and northeastern Carolinas, it can be brought to Norfolk. And then considering that the Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia and tends to be protected, even to the point that in the winter of 77 and 78, you had Valley Forge, you had Washington there. This bay is left unprotected for 3 years. The British don't come back until 79, and that's only temporarily. Ultimately, they come back in 81. So that leaves it open for us to get provisions to those up north, either by land, which is a tough circuitous route because you have to go inland to get to the King's Highway, and so you can take your items up. But more importantly, you can go by water from Norfolk. And what would take 3 weeks by cart takes a week using the Chesapeake Bay on the average. And so militarily, you've opened the channel, not just for provisions and supplies, but you've also freed up possible militia soldiers to serve along with the Continentals, or more rifle companies to add to the Continentals. So, the impact, first of all, this battle made it clear to many Virginians that, wow, Virginia militia can defeat British regulars. This was not considered a doable thing. And then secondly, saying, okay, now that we've been without royal government, we can make our own decisions. And rather than making a stand to say, I want to be an Englishman, give me the same right, the stand you said, well, I want to be an American, and we'll determine our own rights. So the decisions start, the philosophy starts to change. And last but not least, as I just mentioned, it opens the supply lines to Washington's forces for use in the broader war. what we hope to be lasting historic significance. Just as a note, because this question was asked last time, are there any colonial buildings left from the Revolutionary War in Great Bridge? Well, much like Norfolk, the answer is no. And it wasn't because of this, but remember, they come back in 1781. And this is a map done in 1781. And when they came back here, they said, well, look, we need a fort down there. But let's not put it north of the bridge, as we did here in 1775. Let's put it down here. Of course, that's a pretty swampy area. But they built it up with sand and made a foundation. And then where the village was is still there, so it lines up nicely. But in order to build the barracks and the homes for the officers, they dismantled the village and burned the rest because they figured that was fair, because it was a patriot town or a rebel town to build that fort. Now the fort was never really used, but we know we've been able to extract some bits from there because when the canal was built, the canal, of course, let's get myself oriented here, basically goes this way. And when they dug the canal, they noticed that the composition of the soil changed, and there was much sand there for a leveling purpose for building the fort, and that matched up very neatly with the maps that had been recovered. So, like Norfolk, Great Bridge suffered the same fate as trying to hang on to colonial aspects. I appreciate your attention. Hopefully I haven't put too many to sleep. I didn't put too many loud bangs in there. The sources that I have here are out on the table. One particular note that I know doesn't get a lot of circulation is Mike Cecier's Cast Off the Yoke. It is just what I would have written if he hadn't written it first, on drawing quotes to build this case on why Great Bridge was of significance and what happened to us in the Revolution. We sincerely hope that when this is built, and this is the Visitor Center and Museum, its soft opening is scheduled for November of next year. We've broken ground, and we've got, and on Friday we have a meeting with the museum interior designer, Riggs and Ward, who are working that. So we're making great progress. We hope to see you down there, and so I will leave it to if there's any questions. Yes, sir. Oh, I would figure Mike would. I can't explain why the Mets did so poorly that day.
I can explain why the British recognized it was sea fog, the necessity, the advantages it gave to them, the superior fleet, all that allowed participating over 3 years.
Yeah, that's a puzzlement to me as well. You know, why would the British, that have such a strong naval arm, allow the Chesapeake Bay open? I believe because they were so fixated on the other estuary of Hudson. And the New York and the Hudson was primary to them. And if they could keep that waterway to Canada, cut off the New England states, that meant more to them than this estuary that ran up into Pennsylvania that sometimes was with the king, sometimes not. And I think that they just saw that as a more vital line of communication than the Chesapeake, because the Chesapeake went from the number 5th port to the hinterland, basically, at that time. So it led nowhere, where the Hudson leaves from New York, and you can make your passage with a little bit of portage to, well, certainly into Canada and to the St. Lawrence. I think that was one of their greatest errors. And Dunmore continued to try to get efforts to come back to retake Virginia, but it wasn't until later, and I think that opens the broader question on the changes between Howe and Clinton, the commanders of the British, on why they do what they did. And sometimes it's just because of whim. Norfolk just wasn't considered important when you were dealing with New York and Charleston. in Philadelphia. And so I don't think it just didn't get up on the scale. I don't know if that answers your question. That's my good number. Yes, sir.
Do you see this 1777 fighting in Virginia as to some extent a resumption of Bacon's rebellion back 100 years earlier? Those who didn't have much rebelling against the landed gentry and the merchant class?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not that well versed on Bacon's rebellion, although I will say this. The attitude in Virginia was pretty busted up. I mean, there were many loyalists. There was good reasons to be loyal to the crown. And there's a very small nucleus of patriots. There's a lot of people in between that just want to get on with their lives and do what they're doing. And so in many respects, similar to New England, the patriots were smaller, but to use today's terms, their ability to use information and propaganda to influence the situation or intimidation to influence your neighbor could be very convincing. So for those that were undecided, if the king's forces were there, I'm loyal to the king. If the patriots are here, whatever you need, I won't get in your way. And so they tended to change hat pins from my perspective. But when they see Virginia militia defeat British regulars, then they say, okay, if I was undecided before, I'm deciding this way because it looks like you're the ones that are going to protect me and not the crown. I know that kind of doesn't really address the Bacon's rebellion side of it, but there may have been part of that, but I tend to think it was just more who's going to protect me when I need protection. Yes, sir.
Can you talk about your outfit? What season?
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess I don't need the point. The outfit, this would be something similar to what a rifleman would wear. Of course, all colonials would wear the breeches. Any gentleman would always have a waistcoat. You would never be caught without a waistcoat. And so the hunting frock was standard for the frontiersmen. It would be either green, or many of the Culpeper Minutemen had purple. And I found that interesting until I ran across this person that said, well, you know, archaeology was done up in the Culpeper area for fossils, and there is this particular stone that is used for purple dye. I said they probably were purple because that's what was in. But if you were working for the Committee of Correspondence or maybe safety, you'd have a courier's pouch. I don't have my knapsack that has my mug and my little tin pan, powder horn, canteen, just an ammunition pouch, although it would be a true ammunition pouch would be a little handier than this. Most of the Continentals wore black hats. Of course, most of the hats in those days were black. It's just that, it's like the Model T. You get any color as long as it's black. Many times the medallion or the cockade would represent rank, or it could represent unit. The feather, most of the frontiersmen would either put a feather in there or a deer tail on their cap. I found a feather was easier to find than deer tail. So knife, I don't have my tomahawk on. I usually put the tomahawk back in here. And I don't bother with my long rifle. One, I don't have one yet. Christmas next year. And two, since most of my work is done in schools when we're talking to fifth graders, you're not bringing that long rifle into that school, I'll tell you that.
Thank you.
Okay.